Most of us here know what it means to be a grits girl. For those of you who don't know, I'd be really surprised if there's someone that doesn't. But it literally means girl raised in the South. But there's certain aspects that go with being a grits girl or a Southern girl. For instance, the ideal grits girl is probably someone who goes to oyster oats instead of going to parties and loves eating fried chicken and grits and ends up marrying a redneck who owns a huge black truck and owns a Charleston-style home and tons of sweetgrass baskets hanging on the wall. And even though I've lived in the South for a really long time, I don't consider myself to be Southern. And a lot of my friends and family give me a hard time about it and try to argue with me otherwise. But I don't consider myself to be a Southern girl completely because I haven't lived in the South my entire life. In fact, I didn't move here until I was 11 years old because I was an Army brat before then. So for these reasons, I consider myself to be a semi-Southerner. Because although I love the Southern way of life and consider myself Southern in many ways, the other places that I've lived, the other experiences I've had have helped to make me who I am today. Like I said, I love the South, but I also love the other places that I've lived as well. For instance, Kansas snow. We don't really get snow here like you do in Kansas. Texas heat is a lot drier than South Carolina heat, so it's still hot, but it's more bearable. Same thing with California heat. Also Pacific Ocean. It's totally different than the Atlantic Ocean in a lot of ways. Clam chowder, we don't really have that here. It's not nearly as good as in California. Also, some of my personal opinions have been shaped in ways, in other places in ways that would not be if I lived in the South my entire life. For instance, I almost hate to tell people this here in the South, but I'm a diehard liberal and Democrat. And I think it's mainly because, or partly because I lived in California for so long, and there's a lot of Democrats there. Also, I lived in Saudi Arabia when I was 3 years old, and though I was only 3 at the time and don't really remember it that well, my mom definitely does, and her experiences and what she's told me about her experiences have made me a pretty big feminist. And you know, I lived in all these places before I moved to the South, but the South has always been a big part of me just because my mom's from the South and all of my family lives in the South. So we used to always come down here at least once or twice a year, and I've always loved it. Also, there's certain things about the South that my mom has carried with her and taught my sister and I. So we've always been Southern in a lot of ways, even as kids. For instance, I've always been polite, and that's definitely more of a Southern thing than anywhere else, because my mom taught my sister and I to be. But you know, saying yes ma'am and yes sir and Mr. and Mrs. to adults, my friends would give me a hard time about it in California, but it's almost expected here. So as you can see, I love the South and respect its pride and strong culture. I've definitely embraced Southern culture, and it's embraced me. But I've also embraced my Army brat past. My mom always likes to tell the story of when I was 7 and living in California. I've been hanging out with my friend Madeline, and I'd get home and I was so excited to tell my mom that Madeline had lived in California her entire life. She'd never moved anywhere else. And she just laughed at me and was like, Miranda, that's normal. Because I didn't realize at the time that being an Army brat moving around so much was so rare. But now that I do, being an Army brat is something I cherish and respect. So even though I lived in the South for years, I only consider myself to be a semi-Southerner, because saying otherwise would be acting as if I hadn't lived in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Saudi Arabia, Kansas, Texas, or California.